So last time we began discussing the second section, and you might recall that in the second section, Kant's project is to characterize the supreme principle of morality in terms of a system of three formulas. And we began by talking about the first formula, with special attention to the variant formulation, the formula of law of nature. Um, uh, Now, we apply the formula of law of nature to determine the permissibility of a maxim. And a maxim, recall, is a policy that we implicitly adopt whenever we act. You can think of it as the content of a first-person description of an intention to act. Uh, so it's going to be roughly of the form, it'll specify an action type, it will specify the circumstances under which an action is to be performed, and it will specify the end, or that for the sake of which the action is to be performed. Okay, so in applying the formula of law of nature, our first step is to specify the maxim. Again, the maxim is going to be of the form, I am to perform action A in circumstances C for the sake of end E. Okay. The second step is to generalize this maxim. Okay. So where everyone is to perform action A in circumstances C for the sake of end E. And then the third step is to take this generalized maxim and transform it into a law of nature. So we get, it's a law of nature that everyone performs action A in circumstances C for the sake of end E. Now, the fourth step is to conjoin this hypothetical law of nature with the existing laws of nature, at least as we understand them to be, and to work out the consequences for this new resulting system of nature. Okay. Now, the target maxim that we began with is going to be permissible just in case one can coherently will, right, that the resulting system of nature obtain. Okay. Now, Kant distinguished two tests, recall, for whether we can coherently will the resulting system of nature. There's the contradiction and conception test, right? And this is whether or not the hypothetical system of nature can be conceived without self-contradiction, okay? Well, if you can coherently conceive of the resulting system of nature, that will pass the contradiction and conception test. But if you can't coherently conceive of the resulting system of nature, you'll fail the test and the original maxim would be impermissible. Now, the second test kicks in once you pass the first test. So you can coherently conceive of the resulting system of nature. And now the question is whether you can coherently will the resulting system of nature obtain, okay? Now, there was a question mark about how to understand the contradiction and volition test. And we had some discussion, critical discussion last time about this. By the end of this lecture, we'll be in a position to say explicitly what he means by the contradiction and volition test. Okay, so let's see. Now, there's going to be two potential problems for the application of the formula of law of nature. and I want to just state it abstractly to begin with. One problem would be that the resulting test, right, improperly classifies morally impermissible maxims as morally permissible. So suppose there's this maxim such that if you were to act upon it, you would be behaving immorally. But nonetheless, somehow or another, it passes the test, okay? That would mean the test based on the formula of law of nature would fail to be sufficient for determining the permissibility of the maxim. Now, there's another problem that the test might have, right? It might improperly classify morally permissible maxims as morally impermissible, okay? So again, that would be maxims, which if you acted upon it, you would be acting in conformity with duty, but nonetheless, the test somehow or another tells us that this maxim's impermissible, okay? This would mean that the test failed to be a necessary condition for passing the test fails to be a necessary condition for the maxim to be permissible. Now, I want to talk about two counterexamples of each of these kinds. But what's important is that you understand how the counterexamples work and not so much the counterexample. And it's important for a couple reasons, right? One is if you understand the trick of the counterexample, then even if you forget the details of the specific counterexample, you can generate another one on the fly, right? But more importantly, if you understand the trick, you really are understanding the precise nature of the failure the apparent failure that we're dealing with. So it provides real insight into what's going on. So I really want to focus on, as I said, us understanding the trick in each of these cases. And let's begin with what I described as failures of sufficiency, right? And again, that's where the formula of law of nature improperly classifies immoral maxims as being morally permissible, okay? Now, many commentators, Hegel, Mill, and Sidgwick, among others, have criticized the formula of law of nature on just these grounds, right? That is to say, it improperly classifies immoral maxims as being morally permissible. And again, if there are such maxims, then passing the universalizability test is not sufficient for a maxim to be permissible, okay? Now, how do we come up with a case like that? Well, first notice that maxims can differ in their degree of generality and specificity, okay? So let's consider the maxim that was involved in the prohibition on false promises. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that this will never happen, okay? That was the maxim that Kant gave as an example of morally impermissible maxim. Now, notice the following maxim is based on the one that Kant gives, but it's making it hyper-specific, okay? So when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money from Jones on the second Tuesday of the month and promise to repay it, even though I know this will never happen. Now, this latter maxim is more specific than the former, more general maxim, in the sense that it restricts the conditions under which false promises would be made. Okay. Okay, so the first thing we have to recognize then is that maxims can differ in their generality and specificity. And what we're looking for is a maxim that is hyper specific. Why are we looking for that? Well, notice that the effects of the hypothetical law of nature based on the more specific maxim are going to be less widespread than the effects of the hypothetical law of nature that's based on the more general maxim. Okay, so the effect of making false promises when in need of money will have as a result that no promises will be believed. But notice that the effect of making false promises to Jones on the second Tuesday of the month will have the effect that, well, maybe people named Jones would fail to believe a promise, especially made by someone known to be in debt on the second Tuesday of the month, but otherwise promises would be believed quite generally. And if promises would be believed in general, right, except under certain special circumstances, this would be consistent with the possibility of promising. And if promising's possible in the resulting system of nature, then, well, for all that Kant has said, it's conceivable without self-contradiction. Thus, an immoral maxim to make false promises to Jones on the second Tuesday of the month passes the universalizability test. So passing the universalizability test is not sufficient for the maxim to be morally permissible. Okay. Okay, again, the trick is, was this, look, it's because of the widespread effects of the hypothetical law of nature that led to the bad result that promising wasn't possible. So we'll narrow down the initial description of the maxim so that when it becomes a hypothetical law of nature, its effects will be less widespread and hopefully not inconsistent with the practice of promising, right? And we managed to do that. And so we get the result that an immoral maxim gets classified apparently as morally permissible. Okay, let's look at the second class of counterexamples, the failures of necessity. And this is where the formula of law of nature improperly classifies morally permissible maxims as impermissible. And if there are, in fact, such maxims, right, then the universalizability test is not necessary for a maxim to be permissible. Okay. Now, to see how there could be such maxims, what we need to think about is an innocuous action whose performance depends on its being exceptional. Okay. Now, here's an example. It'll be easier to see what's going on. But again, let me state the trick, right? It's a morally innocuous action whose existence depends on being exceptional. Okay. Now, there's nothing immoral about the following financial policy. Suppose I set for myself the following policy: I will sell my stocks when the Dow hits 10,000. Now, that policy would lack the financial benefits that it actually has, in a possible world where it's a law of nature that everyone sells their stock when the Dow hits 10,000. After all, if everyone is selling, who's left to buy? And if no one's buying, then selling the stock is not possible under those circumstances. But that means that the resulting system of nature cannot be conceived without self-contradiction. Thus, a morally permissible maxim to sell stock when the Dow hits 10,000 fails the universalizability test, so passing the universalizability test is not a necessary condition for a maxim to be morally permissible. So it looks as if applying the formula of law of nature fails to provide a test, the satisfaction of which is both necessary and sufficient for a maxim to be morally permissible. Or at least, and this is very important, at this stage of the groundwork, our understanding of the first formula is subject to these failures. Now, recall these three formulas are supposed to represent different aspects of the same law, right? They're each partial or incomplete portraits of the single principle, the supreme principle of morality. And this places a constraint on our interpretation of them. Each should be interpreted in light of the other. So perhaps when the formula of the law of nature is interpreted in light of the other formulas, the apparent failures of necessity and sufficiency will be avoided. And indeed, Kant discusses the four examples again in light of the formula of humanity, the second formula. And his case for the impermissibility of these maxims is deepened and illuminates and supports his earlier argument. So one possibility is that the failures of necessity and sufficiency are due to an incomplete understanding of the formula of law of nature. Okay, that's a very real possibility, and we need to be open to this, and this will give certain significance to our reading of the second formula. However, even so, perhaps, right, the formula of law of nature was never intended to be a mechanical algorithm for determining the permissibility of maxims, right? Maybe it's not some machine which you feed in a permission slip, right, and crank the handle and it'll turn out either approved or unapproved, right? When Kant claimed that the first formula is a compass sufficient for common rational moral cognition to act in conformity with duty, perhaps he didn't promise a test, the satisfaction of which is necessary and sufficient for the permissibility of a maxim. And even if there were such a test, right, no such test would be mechanical, right? The application of the formula of law of nature not only requires background empirical information about the laws of nature as they actually are, right, but requires judgment as to relevance as well, okay? So it's not a purely mechanical test. Now, if the first formula is not an algorithm, right, for determining the permissibility of maxims, well, what sense is it a moral compass? Okay. Now, Kant provides an explicit answer here. And allow me to read you this passage from Kant. He says, look, if we now attend to ourselves in any transgression of duty, we find that we don't really will that our maxim should become a universal law. since that is impossible for us, but that the opposite of our maxim should instead remain a universal law, only we take the liberty of making an exception to it for ourselves, or uh, just for this once, to the advantage of our inclination. Consequently, if we weighed all cases from one and the same point of view, namely that of reason, we would find a contradiction in our will, namely that a certain principle be objectively necessary as a universal law and yet subjectively not hold universally, but allow for exceptions. I want to highlight for you that last formulation, right? The contradiction in our will, namely between a principle that's objectively necessary as a universal law and yet subjectively not hold universally but allow exceptions, okay? Now, normally, right, when we act contrary to duty, we will, right, that the opposite of our maxim should instead remain a universal law, only we take the liberty of making an exception to it for ourselves, or just for this once, to the advantage of inclination. So when you're tempted to make a false promise, when in need of money, we don't will that everyone should make false promises when in need of money. Rather, if we succumb to temptation, we will that that in general people truly promise, only that we just this once falsely promise to repay a creditor. So in acting contrary to duty, a person gives unjustifiable preference to their own inclinations over the needs of inclinations of other finite rational beings. Okay. Now, um, uh, so maybe the first formula is a moral compass for those lost to temptation in the following sense. It's a reminder not to make oneself a special exception to a moral law that everyone else must follow. Perhaps the moral point of the first formula is a vivid reminder not to give unjustifiable preferences to one's inclinations over the inclinations of other finite rational beings, and hence as a corrective to our human propensity to make exceptions for ourselves. Okay, so try to remember, if you can, the contradiction in the will is between an objective principle that holds universally and yet subjectively admits of exceptions, right? That's really what's going on with the contradiction in volition test. Okay, so let's share the screen here. Okay, let's talk about the formula of humanity. Now, whereas the first formula of the supreme principle of morality specified, as Kant says, the form of the law, right? And here he's drawing our attention to the fact that it's valid for all rational beings. He says that the second formula specifies its matter, right? And what does he mean by the matter of the law? Well, the end involved in acting on a law that's valid for all rational beings, okay? So here is the formula of humanity. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Now, many find this formula emotionally resonant, but equally people are puzzled about how you could apply this formula to derive more specific duties. So it's going to be important for us to look at how to apply this formula. But before we talk about the application of the formula, we're going to have to, first of all, get in place certain key terms, like what he means by an end and things like that. Also, we're going to briefly look at the derivation of the second formula, because the positive argument for it is of enduring philosophical interest, I believe. Okay, so let's begin by getting in place some notions that we'll need right now. Ends are that for the sake of which we act. And Kant is going to distinguish between two kinds of ends. There are objective ends on the one hand, and there are subjective ends. Objective ends are ends given by reason alone, right? And they're ends that are going to be valid for all rational beings, right? So there are ends that you've got reason to adopt that's quite independent of your inclination, but you've got a reason to adopt simply because you're a rational being. If there are such ends given by reason, they're objective ends. Subjective ends, on the other hand, are ends given by inclination, right? And these can vary from one rational being to another. Remember, inclination depends in part on the faculty of feeling, and faculty of feeling is grounded on facts about our bodies. And since these can vary from one person to the other, right, so can our inclinations. Now, terminology is useful to get down when Kant calls, Kant will speak of objective ends as motives and subjective ends as incentives, okay? So when you hear the word motive in the Mary Gregor translation, right, you've got to think of an objective end. When you hear incentive, you've got to think of a subjective end. Now, every action, according to Kant, has an end. We always act for the sake of some end or another. So in acting from duty, we act for the sake of some end. And since the moral law is valid for all rational beings, we learned that from the first formula, the end involved in acting from duty has got to be an objective end or a motive. Now, when Kant's describing the nature of motives, he's providing additional information of what it means to act from duty. In the first section, Kant characterized acting from duty as acting from respect for the moral law. We saw that respect for the law was merely the determination of the will by the law, valid for all rational beings, and consciousness of this determination. This, however, he said, merely specified the form of the law, but not its matter. Furthermore, we saw in the first section, Kant remarked that he does not yet see what this respect is based upon. This, the philosopher may investigate. Well, Kant is now undertaking just that philosophical investigation, right? In describing the nature of motives, Kant's describing the end involved in acting from duty that's the basis for the respect for our moral law. Okay. Now, we need just some more distinctions, okay? So subjective ends or incentives, ends that are given by inclination, have only a conditional value or worth, and hence are only grounds of hypothetical imperatives. Objective ends or motives, ends given by reason alone, have a different significance. And here is a very important passage. It comes just before, right, the derivation of the second formula. But suppose there were something, the existence of which in itself has absolute worth. Something which as an end in itself could be a ground of determinate laws. Then it and it alone would lie the grounds of possible categorical imperative, that is, of a practical law. Now, Kant is describing the nature of motive or objective ends and is supposing the existence of something that's got three features, right? It's an end in itself, it's an existent end, and it's got absolute worth. And let's really consider these in turn, okay? So first, Kant supposing the existence of something that is an end in itself. Now, an end in itself is something whose worth is unconditional, independent of inclination, and it's valid for all rational beings. And he contrasts ends in themselves with what he calls relative ends. And relative ends are ends whose worth is conditional, dependent upon inclination, and which varies from one rational being to another. Relative ends could only be incentives and hence could only be the grounds of hypothetical imperatives. So whatever's got a ground, right, a categorical imperative, right, it has to be an end in itself. Now, the second thing Kant is presupposing is the existence of what he calls an existent end or an independently existing end. An existent end is something that already exists, whose existence is in itself an end. Now, you might be puzzled about that, right? And you might be puzzled about that because you might be conflating the general notion of an end with a more specific notion, what Kant calls ends to be affected, right? So existent ends contrast with ends to be affected. An end to be affected is something brought about by your action, okay? And it's tempting to suppose that there's nothing more to the concept of an end than a state of affairs brought about by one's action. But Kant's insight here is that the notion of end is broader than that. An end is that for the sake of which we act. And to be sure, sometimes at least, we act for the sake of bringing about some state of affairs by means of our actions. But we can act for the sake of other ends as well. So, for example, we can act for the sake of self-preservation and continued well-being, okay? Self-preservation, right? If the self is to be preserved, it's got already to exist, right? So it's not something that's brought about by my action, right? Rather, right, I'm preserving its existence rather than generating its existence, right? Continued well-being, right? Well, if you're enjoying well-being and you act for the sake of your continued well-being, right? Perhaps by getting exercise, any number of things will aid in one's continued well-being. Well, you're not bringing your well-being into existence, right? You're already currently enjoying it, right? Rather, you're acting so as that you can continue to enjoy this state of well-being into the future. Now, notice these ends can't be brought about by our actions, but are already existing state of affairs that we merely preserve or at least do not act against. Okay. Um, now, so we've got the notion of an end in itself. We've got the notion of an existent end, and finally, we need the notion of absolute worth. And here, Kant is invoking the Stoic distinction between dignity and price. Okay, so absolute worth is the kind of value of a thing that possesses dignity. Let's begin, however, with the notion of price. Okay, a price is a value that is fungible. Okay, so if you have a pound coin, right, and I take it and give you a different pound coin, you have lost nothing, right? Because the value of a pound coin is fungible, right? You can exchange it without any loss for a distinct pound coin. That's the distinctive feature of price. It's fungibility, right? You can things that have price are things that admit of exchange for other items of equal value, right? That such an exchange makes sense is what constitutes the fungibility of the value, right? Dignity, however, is a value that can't be exchanged for a mere price. Okay. Now, think of being unwilling to sell something for any price, right? Think of, I don't know, someone inviting you to sell one of your family members. You be puzzled about what on earth they had in mind. Why? Because the value of your family members is such that they're not exchangeable for a mere price. Okay, that's the kind of thing that Kant has in mind with dignity, right? So dignity is such that you can't exchange if something has absolute worth or dignity, you can't exchange it for something of equal value, right? And in addition, absolute worth is going to be more valuable than things with a mere price. And in effect, what we're going to see in human wrongdoing is that people are exchanging something that possesses dignity for a mere price. Okay, so we've got three things, three features. There's being an end in itself, an existent end, and something with absolute worth. And Kant is going to make negative and positive claims, right? He's going to say that he's going to provide an argument that um, uh, uh, what could not possess these three features, right? And he says the objects of inclination couldn't possess these features. The inclinations themselves couldn't possess these features. And finally, that non-rational beings that don't depend upon our will could not possess these features. But I want to focus not on his negative argument, but his positive argument. And his positive argument is that is an argument for our rational nature or humanity to be an end in itself. Okay. Now, notice it's an existent end. It's arguably a end in itself, and arguably has absolute worth. Okay. Now, he's not in a position to demonstrate, right, that humanity is an end in itself. Rather, he tries to argue that we necessarily, if implicitly, presuppose this. Now, what I've done here on the slide is all I've done is I've enumerated, right, distinct steps in Kant's argument. So what I've done is regimented the text in a certain way by enumerating key steps in the argument and highlighting some key notions. So let's just read through this. It says the ground of this principle is rational nature exists as an end of itself, end in itself. Well, he says human being necessarily represents his own existence in this way. So far, it is thus a subjective principle of human action. That's the premise that we're really going to have to think a little bit about what it could possibly mean. But every other rational being also represents his own existence in this way, consequent on just the same rational grounds that holds for me. Thus, it is at the same time an objective principle from which, as a supreme practical ground, it must be possible to derive all laws of the will. And the practical imperative will therefore be the following: so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Now, let's look at the first step. Human being necessarily represents his own existence in this way. So far, it is thus a subjective principle of human action. Bracket the subjective bit for a moment, right? Just think that human beings necessarily represent their rational nature as an end in itself. Now, it seems like this cannot be read as a contingent empirical claim about how people explicitly value their own existence, for so interpreted, it would be false. Unfortunately and tragically, some people regard their existence as being without worth. So, how are we to understand one, right, this first step of the argument, such that it has a chance of being true? Now, I'm going to give you an answer, and the answer, at least in general outline, is due to Christine Korsgaard. And according to Korsgaard's interpretation, our humanity or rational nature is going to consist in, at least in part, in our capacity to set ends for ourselves, right? So, I don't know. Suppose you set as an end learning a new language, right? Well, this capacity that you have to set a goal for yourself, to set an end towards which you will be acting, right, is according to Kant a feature of our humanity or rational nature. So Kant might be understood, and this is Korsgaard's thought, as claiming that when we value the ends that we set for ourselves, we must implicitly, at least, value our capacity to set those ends, whether or not we explicitly value this capacity in our own person. I mean, if you didn't value the capacity to set ends for yourself, well, what confidence could you have on the value you place on the ends that you've set? So, our capacity to set ends is an existent end, right? It's something that already exists, whose value is unconditional, right? at least it doesn't depend on the ends that we set or our inclinations. So far, and moreover, the capacity to set ends is confined to rational beings, right? So far, humanity seems like a good candidate for being an end in itself. But before he can conclude this, Kant has to establish that humanity has worth or value valid for all rational beings, right? That's why at this point in the argument, he's merely claiming to have established a subjective principle, right, of human action. If our common humanity is the grounds of our practical principles, right, valid for all rational beings, it's got to be an objective principle. Okay, so how do we establish that? Well, that's where the second and third steps of the argument come in. Thus, the second step claims that every rational being also represents their own existence as an end in itself on just the same rational ground that holds for every other rational being, namely their rational nature. So we've got to understand the value of rational nature as an objective value for all rational beings. So as step 3 claims, all rational beings are ends in themselves, and others, and this makes an objective claims on all rational beings to recognize themselves and others as ends in themselves. And that leads to step 4, the formulation of the categorical imperative as an to use humanity in every rational being always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Okay, so that's the derivation. I've gone through the derivation because it's been philosophically rich, but also these distinctions between, for example, what's an end in if to be affected versus an existent end. Those are going to be important distinctions as you continue on thinking about ethics. So let's now shift gears and talk a bit about how to apply the formula of humanity. And the formula of humanity demands that our actions express respect for the dignity of humanity, right? So you can think of it as positing an expressive reason for doing things. This is a familiar class of reasons, right? Very often it's the expressive meaning of an action that's your reason for performing that action. So the reason for saying thank you is to express gratitude. This kind of reason is involved and motivates people to salute the flag or make a rude remark. So the formula of humanity requires that we treat humanity as end and never merely as means in order to express respect for the dignity of humanity. Now, it's very important, the formula of humanity doesn't forbid you from using another person as a means. So when you buy a stamp from a postal clerk, you are using the postal clerk as a means of acquiring a stamp, despite the postal clerk's evident humanity. Now, there may be nothing morally amiss in this. Rather, what the formula of humanity forbids is omitting to treat a person at the same time as an end. Okay, so you can treat other people as means so long as you treat them at the same time as an end. It would seem then that the injunction to treat people never merely as a means is redundant, right? The entire moral content of the formula of humanity consists in the injunction to treat people as ends in themselves. So why emphasize never merely as a means? Um, and here I think the emphasis can be interpreted as a rhetorical response to a certain diagnosis of human wrongdoing. Again, human beings have a tendency to act contrary to duty, not because they fail altogether to value humanity, but because they misconceive the kind of value it has. Thus, as human beings, we have a tendency to place greater value on the objects of our inclination, which merely have a price or relative worth, over the value of humanity, which instead has a dignity or absolute worth. And this both complements and illuminates the moral point of the first formula. Kant observes that normally, when we act contrary to duty, we will that the opposite of the maxim should instead remain a universal law, only we take the liberty of making an exception to it for ourselves to the advantage of our inclination. So, in acting contrary to duty, a person gives unjustifiable preference to their own inclinations over the inclinations of other finite rational beings. Notice that when we make an exception for ourselves, we fail to express proper respect for the dignity of humanity in ourselves or in the person of others. And indeed, right, Kant anticipates this explicit connection in the first section when he says, when you make an exception of yourselves, this corrupts the principles at their basis and destroys all their dignity, something that even common rational moral cognition cannot in the end call good. So in making exceptions for ourselves, we sacrifice the dignity of humanity in the person of another or in ourselves for a mere price, and hence fail to respect that dignity. That's the key insight, I believe, in the formula of humanity. Now, um, next time I'm going to begin by talking about how to run through and apply the formula of humanity to um, the four examples. Okay. And I'm going to point out how some of the alleged problems with the first formula get solved if the first formula gets read in light of the second formula. Uh, and it's also at that point where we'll be in a position fully to appreciate what was at play in the contradiction in volition test. So next time I'll begin by talking about how to apply the second formula to the four examples, and then we'll talk about the third formula. Okay, and just by way of advertisement, whereas the first formula specified the form of the law, right? This formal feature, the fact that the moral law is valid for all rational beings. The second formula specifies the matter of the law, the end or that for the sake of which you act in acting on a law that's valid for all rational beings. The third formula, right, doesn't reveal a third feature. There's a kind of asymmetry here. He says is rather manifests the systematic interconnectedness. And what he has in mind is, especially in the derivation of the third formula, how he's drawing on ideas that occurred in the derivation of the first formula and the derivation of the second formula, right? So the third formula is really showing how the first two are systematically interconnected. And that's what we'll be discussing next time. Okay. That's it for today. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.